Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Naomi Lagoswa and I lead on integration and inclusion for the Growth Company. We're hosting today's Disability Confident webinar in partnership with Irwin Mitchell and InWorkGM. My co-host Daniela Kent from Irwin Mitchell will explain more about their work shortly, but just to give a brief overview of the Growth Company and InWorkGM. The Growth Company is a not-for-profit, commercially driven organisation dedicated to economic development, inward investment, skills, employment and enterprise. We're part of the Alliance Partnership InWorkGM alongside Indius, and it also includes CTech Plus, who provide specialist health and disability support, and Pathway CIC, who offer wellbeing services. InWorkGM deliver the Working Well, Working Health programme on behalf of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Through the programme we deliver, our aim is to support Greater Manchester residents with health conditions and disabilities to find sustainable employment. 8.1 million working age people in the UK have a disability. The Disability Confidence Scheme supports employers to make the most of the talents disabled people can bring to your workplace. As disability confident leaders, our aim is to support more organisations to reap the benefits of inclusive recruitment practices. We recognise that we are still in uncertain times and it is challenging for many businesses. That said, we've seen some real positives emerge during the last few months, particularly around flexible and agile working. So please put any questions you have in the Q&A and we'll try and get through as many as possible. Firstly, I'm going to hand over to my co-host Daniela Kent from Irwin Mitchell to talk to you about her role as resourcing project manager and how Irwin Mitchell are becoming disability confident. Over to you, Daniela.
Hi, thanks Naomi, and good morning. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and we're delighted to partner with the Growth Company and InWorkGM to host today's webinar and share what I hope will be some useful information on how we're making Irwin Mitchell a more inclusive business for colleagues with disabilities. So today I'd like to share with you why we need to do more to support disabled talent, particularly in law, where we started as a business in our disability confident journey, and the opportunities of our new normal working in a post-COVID world, and the opportunities that presents for colleagues with disabilities. So I'll start by telling you a little bit more about who we are here at Irwin Mitchell. And about me. So I'm Daniela Kent and I joined Irwin Mitchell in January as a project manager within HR, where my focus was really on diversity and talent. So how we attract a diverse pool of talent, how we make sure our process of recruitment is very inclusive, how we select that talent, removing unconscious bias, particularly at face-to-face interview. And then since April, I've also taken on the role of acting diversity and inclusion manager, which allows me to focus on D&I, not just from a talent perspective, but across the whole of our firm. So I'll tell you a little bit about who we are. So we were founded in 1912 to represent rival gangs in Sheffield, and it's fair to say quite a lot has changed since then. So we've grown and we now have over 3,000 employees in 14 offices across the UK, and we are the country's biggest full service law firm. We're an anomaly in the legal industry in that we have more female partners than any other UK law firm, and we also have one of the lowest gender pay gaps in our industry. We're in the top 20 super large employers for women and officially a great place to work based on our GPTW scores, which is fantastic. And in recent years, we've really upped the ante when it comes to addressing mental health and well-being, and our LGBTQ plus initiatives. Our LGBTQ plus network is award-winning. We were delighted to be named in the Stonewall Top 100. And we've won lots of awards for diversity, inclusion and well-being over the last few years. So it's fair to say we really care about creating an inclusive Irwin Mitchell where everyone can flourish. While we've made great strides with some of our diversity work, we felt that the disability agenda just wasn't moving forward in the same way, and it just was not making the same progress. So moving on to the next slide, please, James. So when we started to think about disabled talent, particularly within law, we drew on two really big pieces of information. So some of what you can see on the screen now is provided by the SRA, which is the Solicitors Regulation Authority, and some of it has come from a 2-year research project by the Law Society called Legally Disabled, which surveyed loads of professionals from the industry, particularly lawyers and barristers and paralegals who identify as having a disability or long-term health condition. And some of the stats that you can see came from that research. So when we looked at that, I'm sure you'll all agree, there are some pretty depressing statistics there. So only 3% of lawyers with a disability would share that disability or health condition with their employer, and that is predominantly because of a fear that it will negatively affect their career progression or that they'll be actively discriminated against at work. And that's compared to 19% of UK working adults that would have a disability or health condition. So there's a huge gap there, and we know that disability reporting is massively underrepresented in law for that reason. 80% of the people that took part in the survey also reported that requesting workplace adjustments with their employer was a stressful experience or it caused them anxiety, and 90% reported a negative experience when using legal recruitment agencies. So when we looked at this research, and we already had in mind that disability wasn't progressing along the diversity agenda as quickly as some other characteristics, this was really the starting point for us to have some really honest conversations as a business about where we are from a disability confident perspective. And whilst many of you who are watching today may not be in the legal industry and might wonder how relevant these stats are to you, I would place a pretty hefty bet on similar figures being replicated across other UK industries. But really the purpose of sharing this with you is to highlight just how big an issue this is in our industry. And really what we've learned is you can't begin to address a problem that people can't see exists. And one thing that people can't really argue with is data. So on to the next slide. So what I'd like to talk about now is just how we started our disability confident journey. So where it began, in late 2019, we signed up to the Disability Confidence Scheme as a level 1 employer, which means we are committed. So we signed up to those commitments, and for those of you that haven't yet signed up, I would encourage you to do so. But one of the messages that came from some of our exec members at the time was, yeah, level 1's great, but literally anyone can sign up to it. It's not really achieving much of a positive change. So we already knew then that our ambition would be to become a disability confident leader, like businesses such as the Growth Company. And how we've started to work towards that is we've spent the last 6 months working with other disability confident leaders. So I reached out to those organisations via LinkedIn, contacts we already had, sort of beg, stole and borrow those contacts. And they were from organisations like Auto Trader, KPMG, the Growth Company. And the purpose of those initial conversations was I literally asked, where did you start? And for me, it was important that we looked outside of our industry and learned from businesses who were genuinely affecting change in the disability at work agenda. And these companies being so willing to have those open conversations with us has been really invaluable for us in taking our first steps. And it gave us some confidence that actually a lot of people don't know where to start. There is a lot of fear around approaching a disability agenda because people are worried about getting it wrong and the negative impact that can have not only on the colleague, but also on your own brand. But actually speaking to these other businesses who were like, you know what, we didn't know where to start either, but this is how we did it. That was very reassuring, gave us a lot of confidence to start working through our own strategy. And the next thing was around listening to our own colleagues. So we have a disability networking group within our wider diversity network. And for me, this, as the D&I manager, this group is a really invaluable tool for us in listening to the challenges that our colleagues face, but also the wider challenges about what it's like to have a visible or invisible disability in society. And though it's important to make sure you don't pile all the responsibility of disability strategy onto colleagues who have disabilities, it is really useful to listen to them and to let them help you shape this strategy, because they do know best. So for example, with me, you know, as a wheelchair user, a very visible disability, but I've made it really clear here at IM, you know, up to exec level, that does not make me an expert on the whole spectrum of disability. And I also need to learn from colleagues who face different challenges. So education, awareness, support and empowerment, we feel are really key to us moving forward. And fundamental to influencing real change is empowering our colleagues and leaders. So one thing we found over the last few months is that some of our leaders, and this includes our execs, are nervous when it comes to disability. You know, they are afraid of doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, not supporting colleagues in the right way. And one thing we absolutely don't want to do is make any assumptions. And that's where we need to, as an employer, we need to be the one that opens that conversation with colleagues, candidates during the recruitment process. It can't be down to them to always come to us. And when we think about 80% of people finding workplace adjustment requests very stressful, again, we believe the onus really should be on the business to take some to take that conversation to the colleague and ask what it is they need, but also how important it is that that's an ongoing conversation. So it doesn't just take place as soon as someone starts and that's it. It needs to form part of performance reviews, because things can change, and we need to make sure that we're providing the right support throughout a colleague's life cycle with the organisation. So on to the next slide, please. So these I guess are the key things that I look at when I'm thinking about our disability strategy, and really it starts with data. So I think it's easy to look at your organisation, particularly if you work in HR, and assume that you know where the issues are, which departments might struggle with something like this, but actually the data can tell a very different story. So it's important to start with that. And what we found is that while our response rate from colleagues to share their diversity data was quite high, it was quite low when it came to sharing information about disabilities and health conditions. And part of that is, you know, we need to change the language that we use. So I think a lot of the time people talk about asking candidates and colleagues to declare or disclose disabilities and health conditions, and actually we feel like that language is quite negative. You know, it's not criminal to have a disability, so it's about asking colleagues to share that information and being really open with them about what we'll use that information for. So the fact it will never be used on an individual level, but that it will help us shape a strategy that supports everybody. And then when it comes to the network, this is about our diversity network, using them to listen, learn and encourage allies within the organisation and get executive sponsorship of the strategy. We've also learned from experts like Purple Space, Business in the Community, the Law Society, and we developed our inclusive leadership programme in partnership with Delta Alpha Psi. We have also spent the last 7 months working closely with DWP's Disability Confident Advisors, asking them to audit our recruitment process and coming up with solutions together to make sure that it's inclusive, not just for people with physical disabilities and health conditions, but also for neurodiverse candidates as well. And what we want to do through our leaders as well is change the landscape of disability at work. So change the language that's used, be mindful that disability is often approached from the charity model rather than the social model. And we want to promote positive conversations, focusing on the potential and what's possible rather than what isn't. And when it comes to opportunities, as awful as the COVID situation has been, it has also left a raft of opportunity for us to change the way we work forever. And when we think about people with disabilities or health conditions, does home working and flexible working open new opportunities? Does location of the candidate in regards to the role become irrelevant? Does new tech such as Microsoft Teams present new and inclusive ways of supporting our clients, colleagues and communities? And then when it comes to colleagues and talent, we need to hold some of our suppliers such as recruitment agencies to account. Set out our expectations of them and make it clear what our commitment is around disabled talent, and ask that they do the same when they're representing us in the external market, because otherwise they risk undoing all of the work that you might be doing under your own employer brand and internal strategy. So I think my message for you before I hand over to our next speakers is that wherever you are as a business in your disability confident journey, it's really important not to let the fear of doing or saying the wrong thing stop you from taking any positive action. And that's most commonly seen around disability and race. And I think it's also important don't be afraid to ask very direct questions of your own senior leadership team and of your colleagues and your business. And you need to be honest about where you are in that journey. So we are still, I would say, very early on in our disability confident journey. We're really aspirational, but we're not there yet. And we have set out an expectation that whilst we might not always get it right, we absolutely want to try and move forward. So I'd say those are my top tips so far, but I will hand over now to our next speakers. Naomi, would you like to do the intro?
Yeah, thanks, Daniela. Next we have Mark Woodall and Daniel Sharps, who are project managers for the Deaf Centre. They will talk about their work supporting deaf and hard of hearing people into work, as well as sharing personal experiences. Over to you, Mark and Daniel.
Hi everyone, I want to introduce Deaf Centre. I'm one of the project managers, so I am deaf. I'm using speech during this webinar. However, I also got BSL interpreter with me to translate what's been said in front of me because I'm not able to lip read on camera. So I use both forms of communication. So I use speech, BSL, standard spoken English, which means it's just English speaking way. So I thought I'd start with the new slide, please, about statistics. So basically, there are currently 10 million people in the UK who are deaf or have a hearing loss. So this is roughly about 1 in every 6 people. At least 70,000 people in the UK use British Sign Language as their preferred method of communication. So in 2001, the Royal National Institute for Deaf People produced a report which stated that 74% of deaf people are unemployed, which is making them 4 times more unlikely to be employed than a hearing person. And this figure was given before the recession, any talk of Brexit, and obviously during the current pandemic. So therefore, it's very likely that the figure would have now significantly increased. The report stated that 64% of employers would rather employ somebody with a criminal offence than a deaf person. So that's quite a big statement in itself. Go to the next slide, please. So the research shows that from the employer's side, there's a lack of confidence about employing with people with a hearing loss. So this is often linked to feeling that health and safety will be an issue, or they're just feeling that they won't be as good as a hearing person. But this is the opposite. A deaf person usually had an excellent eye for detail, because when one sense is lost, another is enhanced. With low and no cost at all, with reasonable adjustment, health and safety need not be an issue. The next thing is about an employer will think that, oh, they don't know about the advice and support available when they employ a person with a hearing loss. Well, here, we've got services here at Manchester Deaf Centre. We can support an employer from the initial stage, from advertising an accessible job role to the interview stage. And we have deaf awareness and culture and ongoing support when needed. Another issue possibly is that the employer are not aware of the government access to work scheme, which can help meet the cost of reasonable adjustment to a workplace. So access to work is a government-funded employment support programme that aims to help motivated people start or stay in work. They can support with human support, such as interpreters, note taker, or a lip speaker, or just special equipment, just as a pager for fire alarm issue. So another example would be the employer worried about being not able to communicate with a deaf person. There are many different forms of communication methods depending on the type of hearing loss. Some people prefer to lip read, like myself. Some people prefer to use speech along with gestures, but some people may use speech as sign language as their mode of communication. Whatever method of communication, there is no need for it to be a barrier. Access to work will pay for communication support as long as needed. This is usually during the induction and any additional training or meetings, as the individual will be able to continue in their role without support. However, should the person need support during the job role, it could be that they need use a telephone. Well, they need an interpreter. Access to work will pay for that. However, unfortunately, due to employers not having the knowledge of the information, it's very rarely that they give a deaf person a chance. So, an example of this, if we go on to the next slide, please. I will discuss the barriers. This is a real life example what we did at Manchester Deaf Centre. So what we did and how we explained the process and the barriers the individual went through. So we've had one of the world's largest employer who did not want to employ a deaf person, and the barriers were demonstrated from the beginning. So the first barrier was that a deaf person cannot work due to a health and safety reason. What we did, we provided deaf awareness training to say that, deaf people can work in a warehouse. And the outcome of that was that the employer was quite reluctant, but they agreed to interview the deaf associates. However, the next barrier was that during the interview process, they were being informed that they cannot have the assessment translated because English written down needs to be translated to BSL, which is their first language, but they've been told they can't have it translated. So what we did was explain the language barrier and the role of the interpreter during the translation process. So the outcome of that was the employer agreed. Manchester Deaf Centre supported the deaf person to apply for access to work support during the interview process. However, after when they've done the assessment and what have you, they've been told, the deaf attendees, they would not be informed if they've been successful after the the interview or the assessment on the day. So at that point, we actually had to raise about the Equality Act 2010. So luckily on the day, long story cut short, they've been told that they passed the interview and they passed the assessment process, which was fantastic, and it was a big success. However, after that, we found out that the hearing associate had started working, but the deaf people were not being given a start date. And we supported the deaf person on their behalf with emails and phone calls and even voice messages, but had no response whatsoever. So what we did, after a period of time, we just turned up at the premises and spoke to HR, and we had to explain that this is bordering on discrimination. So it was quite bad, really. So, however, the outcome of that was the date was given and the associate started work, and it's all 5 deaf staff, which was fantastic. However, the last barrier was the at the beginning of the job and the first few weeks, they've been informed by their managers that their packing rates were not as high as the hearing associates, and therefore they have to go down the dismissal route. So we had the deaf staff has spoke to us, and we spoke to the employer, and we arranged what we called a work-based assessment, which is done by the Access to Work. So what they do, they visit the venue and spoke to the employer, spoke to the staff, and did a full assessment. And based on that assessment, the outcome of that was the targets were unrealistic for the deaf person, because they have to listen to a bleep before moving on, that was required. Therefore, reasonable reduced targets were put in place as a reasonable adjustment. And although it's a long process and there's been a struggle for the deaf associates to get into work, they've been working for the company now for over 3 years, and they're doing really, really well. In addition, the organisation have opened another warehouse, and have employed 5 more deaf, hard of hearing associate individuals. So that is a big, big, big achievement. So I will now show a video of a real-life experience of a deaf BSL user who is facing barriers in work. So we need to upload a video, please.
Hi, I have grown up as a deaf BSL user, and I've got a number of experiences where I've had barriers in my life, and that's due to a lot of employers won't employ deaf people. And I believe that's because they think that there'll be a communication breakdown, that there's health and safety issues, that deaf people are not equal to hearing people in how to do the job. They might feel that they have to pay for the interpreter. However, these things aren't true, and they just don't seem to have that full awareness and understanding. So that's what's happened to me. I've had to find a job through a deaf organisation, and having a lot of deaf people working around me. But I would like to mix with the hearing community as well. When I've looked for a job in the past, I've always made sure I've seen the 2 green ticks, or they're part of the employment charter. And that's because they have a good understanding of deaf people. And that is why I would apply for a job with a company who has that, to make sure they have deaf awareness and understanding of deaf issues.
Right, thank you. Danielle.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to Daniela as well, because she has helpfully covered some of the things I was going to cover in my presentation. And like Daniela was saying, and like Mark was saying as well, that the first thing really that we want to say is please don't panic. That there's no need to be afraid if there's an application that lands on the HR desk where somebody has selected to say, yes, I have a disability, yes, I am deaf, then that's absolutely fine. Don't worry about it, because there are people that will be able to support you through that journey. And actually, the fact that that individual has applied for that position and taken the time to apply for that position means that they are probably well suited. So it is worth persevering through these perceived barriers. We'll come on to how we can help with that with training and support as Manchester Deaf Centre, but just first, just a couple of quick things that might be useful to cover in terms of deafness. So you'll see on the notes there, there's big D deaf or little d deaf. So what's the difference? What does that mean? If somebody refers to themselves as deaf with a capital D, they are identifying as culturally deaf. So their deafness is an integral part of who they are. They belong to a linguistic minority, and you simply use a different language to English as their first language. It's a signed language. It has a completely different grammar, completely different structure, and that's why when Mark was saying about the assessment papers, having those translated, that's really important, because reading English, particularly with job applications, we all know how complicated they can be. It's absolutely essential to have that translated into the sign language. Little d deaf, or just deaf people, refer to their deafness usually, and these are kind of sweeping statements, but generally speaking, their deafness is something that they work with every day, but it isn't an integral part of them. So these individuals may wear hearing aids, they may have cochlear implant, bone anchored hearing aids, and so on. They may lip read, and some of these small d deaf individuals may come under the bracket of individuals who have hearing loss, and hearing loss is quite different to deafness, and you may have individuals in your organisation that come under the whole umbrella of deafness. Hearing loss is exactly that, a loss of hearing. So you had hearing to start with that has now degenerated, possibly due to age, possibly due to environment or something else. But it's important to identify which members of your staff are big D deaf, because these are the individuals who may need an interpreter, and they know exactly how to fill out the application when it's translated into their language. They just need the adjustment, that's all. In terms of how to make a big D deaf or little D deaf friend, it's tricky, because particularly big D deaf individuals, they may be the people at work who have an interpreter or maybe a note taker, simply due to a language issue. And it can be hard to get to know those individuals through a third party. So, for example, if you have a colleague who has a sign language interpreter, it's really important to address your questions, address your interest and kind of support to that individual. Ignore the interpreter, actually, is the advice. They are there purely to translate into a language. So, you can get, unfortunately, the scenario of, oh, does she take sugar in her tea? Well, ask me, ask that individual, make a point of learning perhaps easy things, how to say your name, and we'll come on to that in a second, but find a way to actually involve that person directly. And there are a number of ways that we can help you with this. If I can have the next slide, please. The training and support in terms of disability confident and in terms of access to health, you don't have to do it all on your own and start trawling through the internet. As Mark has already said, he and his team have got loads of experience in this. They've supported individuals, they've supported businesses, and the most difficult thing is like the first step, getting in touch and saying, we've had this application and actually this candidate looks really good. How do we start? What do we do first? And that's where we can help. What Mark was also saying with regards to access to work is important to note, because if you do have a deaf or hard of hearing employee in your business, many training courses and things like that are actually covered by the access to work budget. So you can have deaf awareness training for your organisation in order to make kind of a more inclusive, welcoming environment for that individual, and that will not cost you. That will be covered by the access to work scheme. It's important to note that, so don't be afraid of it. The specific courses that we offer, well, we can tailor any of our courses to your specific business. So a course for, inclusive support, like Mark was saying, and deaf awareness in a warehouse is probably going to be quite different to inclusive support and deaf awareness in an office environment. And, we can tailor all of our, I hope you can still see me, apologies for that. We can tailor all of our courses to meet your requirements. You can see down there we have a deaf awareness half a day course, a deaf awareness and introduction to BSL, which is a full day course, and a deaf awareness and interpreter awareness, which is also a full day course. Now, the bottom two are probably the ones that you'll be most likely interested in if you do have a big D deaf sign language using colleague, because it's actually quite a fun course to do together as a team. It really makes that individual feel included, because you are learning about how to express yourself in sign language, which is obviously the language of that the individual's using. And also, in terms of using an interpreter and having access to an interpreter, it's really tricky when you start with, and don't be worried about that, because a lot of people tend to find they direct their questions to the interpreter. So, for example, can you ask if such and such, and we go back to the does she take sugar in her tea, and actually if you take anything away from that, it's actually to ignore the interpreter. They will most likely be standing next to you anyway, or just behind you, interpreting what you're saying into sign language, so you probably won't see them half the time. In terms of other inclusive employment that we do inclusive employer training, so how to actually be an inclusive employer, not just in terms of deafness. There are, like Daniela was saying earlier, loads of hidden disabilities that people may or may want to disclose, so just general inclusive employer training we have. Also, specific access to work training. If you do take on a colleague who will require some support with access to work, not just deafness, any kind of disability, then there's training that we can offer to support you through the access to work system, because it can be a little bit complicated if you haven't done it before. And as Mark has alluded to, we do have lots of experience in that area. And of course, we do our sign language level 1, 2 and 3, currently offering those online and also in-person classes at the Deaf Centre are going to be starting again, hopefully around October time. Can I have the next slide, please, James? Thank you. Okay, and this is a super success story that actually Mark was involved in, and he won't blow his own trumpet, but this was a huge success. You may recognise this gentleman. He is a delivery driver called Tim. Now, Mark knows Tim. He used to attend the job club here at Manchester Deaf Centre, and with the support of Mark and his team, he gained employment as a self-employed delivery driver, and he's enjoying his job a great deal, and he's doing really well. These pictures here, he's pictured with a little girl called Tallulah, who is on Tim's usual delivery round and has taken it upon herself to learn some sign language over lockdown. And there was a absolutely gorgeous little clip on BBC News with the two of them exchanging some conversation using sign language. And it really, you can see the difference it made on Tim, that somebody was making an effort to include him in their day-to-day conversation, and it was just really lovely. So small steps, that's all it takes, and it really can make a big difference. And all I would say really to wrap up, aside from thank you very much for having us, would be any questions, any queries at all, please don't hesitate to contact Mark or myself. We'll be happy to help you. Our email addresses are on there, and also thank you to Naomi for hosting.
Thanks, Mark and Danielle. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to encourage you to post questions in the Q&A section, and just to confirm, we will be sharing a link of the webinar which will include the slides, because I know a few of you are keen to share those with colleagues. So lastly, I'd like to introduce Gary Lamb, the Assistant Director from Walking with the Wounded, to talk about his work supporting disabled people, particularly those with invisible disabilities. Over to you, Gary.
Thank you, Naomi. Hello, everybody. Walking with the Wounded is a military charity that was established in 2010. It was created on the back of a successful expedition where a number of injured soldiers, some quite severely, walked across the South Pole to the North Pole, which highlighted that even if you have a disability, great things can be accomplished. like I say, we was established in 2010, and our charity supports injured veterans who have served in Her Majesty's forces and their families. Our goal is to work collaboratively with numerous organisations, employers and statutory services to provide a plethora of services to ensure mental health therapy is provided, housing, training, and most of all, employment. Walking with the Wounded is a disability confident employer and has regularly employed individuals who have some form of disability. We work alongside key partners to ensure that all the requirements, support and adjustments are effectively in place, so that each individual can work to the best of their ability and not feel isolated or in any way, shape or form separate to any of the other individuals that we work with, that work as part of the team. Disabilities do come in different forms, as you know, and sometimes you cannot see them, but it's imperative to, when you identify these disabilities, that they're not seen as a barrier, but they're seen as an opportunity to bring the best out of that individual. There's a lot of support available to both employers and employees, and as a number of the colleagues have said today, you know, there's people out there that you can actually go to who will provide that specialist support, if you like. I wanted to give you a little bit of an insight into something that's really close to my heart. So back in 2015, DIY SOS came to Manchester to do the Veterans Village, and there was an individual that was on there that was severely injured by an IED explosion in Afghanistan, where he lost both his legs and his arm. That is a visible disability that everybody can see when he's riding his wheelchair or driving his car. But one day he came to me and he said, I'd like to get work. My 5 kids, I want them to look up to me and look at me as a provider to my family, so that they have some kind of work ethic. So we both sat down and I said to him, just tell me what you want to do and what you can achieve, but don't tell me what you can't do. He explained that he could still speak, he could hear, he could see, and he had one good right hand. He then went in to talk to me about what he did in the military, and that he did drones and he did all kinds of kind of video transfers and using certain bits of machinery and equipment. So within 3 weeks of that conversation, he started work with one of the biggest CCTV operators in the country. And he did this for at least 18 months, up until the organisation, who wanted to keep him, by the way, because his experience, his knowledge and his work ethic was invaluable to them. He thrived into that. But what he did, he brought his confidence out. So that job ended because he didn't want to travel all the way to Nottingham. But then he went on to become a 4 times winner of the gold, silver, bronze medals at the Invictus Games. So whereas he would just sat in his room or sat in the house and mixed a little bit, going into work and being given that opportunity by an employer absolutely built his confidence up. And he's now an ambassador of the organisation, and he goes everywhere else. I think I wanted to just be quite clear that Walking with the Wounded supports anyone with any disability. And like Naomi said, there's a lot of hidden disabilities within the military. Now, not all are mad, bad and sad when they come out of the military, but some people have been seriously affected by what they've seen and experienced during combat. PTSD is one of those that is unseen, and it's a word, an acronym that's bound about across the press. But I've had it firsthand. I've worked firsthand with individuals with mental health and PTSD, and it is very, very debilitating for them. And an illness such as PTSD can be a huge barrier to someone reintegrating back into civilian life, and that's where we kind of come in. I've witnessed firsthand how it causes all kinds of issues for the individual and the employers. And yet again, we get involved with the employers, and we support those employers to understand the individual, to make sure that the individual gets the appropriate support that they need. But once identified and the support and the therapy is put in place, it's managed, although it'll never go away. And if you looked at somebody with post-traumatic stress disorder or a mental health disability, you wouldn't think that there's anything wrong with them. Although, you know, organisations such as the Deaf Centre and the Blesma, many other organisations do put so much time and effort into supporting individuals that it just makes sense that these guys are really wanting to work. So you should really be thinking about giving them an opportunity. Understanding disabilities in different ways will benefit any of you, and those who would like to work. by ignoring the disability, it's not the answer. The answer is understanding and supporting it. We've recently recruited a blind individual, which we've never done before. And the initial reaction, even though we are disability confident and we've worked with numerous people with disabilities, the initial thought was, how is it going to be able to get around? How is it going to be able to do what it does? And I think one of the things that you mentioned earlier around the big D and the little d, we didn't know the actual impact of the individual's sight loss, how impaired he actually was. So we've done an assessment with him. He starts in 2 weeks' time, and everything's in place for him to get going. So, you know, that was within 3. We interviewed him last week, and in 2 weeks he starts. So it just goes to show you, if you look at it, things as a barrier, you'll never move on. What I would like to leave you with is there's an individual who's a personal friend of mine who works with the charity, and he's called Duncan Slater, and he's an ambassador for the organisation. Duncan was in an explosion in Afghanistan as well many years ago, and he came home with he stood upright. He looked like he was fine. There was a lot of demons going on in his mind, but also he was in a lot of pain. And he went to the hospital, and he physically asked the doctors to remove his legs because his pain was that bad. Fast forward a couple of 18 months, 2 years later, he finished his first marathon. A couple of years after that, he finished another marathon. A couple of years after that, he finished the Marathon des Sables. He's the first double amputee to ever complete the Marathon des Sables. That's 10 marathons in 10 days in the desert. He inspires people. He's riding his motorbike again. And ultimately, for me, we're all individuals, we're all people. And I think at the end of the day, everyone deserves a chance. So if you've got any questions, or if you're working with any veterans, or you're ever thinking about doing anything to work with veterans who are wounded, injured, or sick, just get in touch. But that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening, and thanks to Naomi and the Growth Company and Irwin Mitchell for inviting me along. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Gary. We're going to move on to our question and answer now. So I'd just like to encourage anybody who would like to ask any questions to any of our speakers to please do so. I'll give you a couple of minutes just to get a chance to have a think and type some questions in. You know, you can ask questions to all of the speakers or someone individually. So please do ask questions. We'd really like to have a quick Q&A before we finish the webinar. Just to confirm, while we're waiting for some questions to come through, we will obviously be sharing the webinar, the link, and we'll also share all of the presenters' details, so you can get in touch with anybody that you would like to do so after the session. So we will share everyone's details. If you'd like more support from any of the organisations or to become disability confident, then we'll share all of those with you. Okay, so I'm going to ask a few questions while we're just waiting for some to come through. So, Gary, just to go back to you, what would you say has been the biggest challenge that your veterans face when moving back into employment?
A lot of the individuals have a difficult transition because you become quite institutionalised when you're in the military. So if you imagine that on top of having a physical or a mental disability, it kind of tenfolds. So one of the main barriers I see on a weekly, daily basis is that people are not aware of how to deal with somebody with a physical or a mental disability, and see it that it's potentially going to cause them a lot of work and time. But when they actually sit down with you and they understand the mechanisms and the support services that are out there to make life easier, then they only have to really try it once and they're convinced, and from there on the door is open to individuals who wish to go and work with their employers, with that employment organisation, sorry.
Great, thank you. Mark and Danielle, could you answer this one, please? Are Access to Work able to support employers with funding and advice on suitable phone technology for staff who have hearing loss?
Yes, that's correct. So if it's got a deaf individual working for an organisation, then they can make contact with Access to Work. They can be done online. So what we've done in the past is support an individual to do an online application for Access to Work site, and then what would happen is they would do an assessment. If it's about equipment, so it would be like a work-based assessment, and then it would decide, for example, if that person says they wanted an amplified phone or where it's a bit louder when you communicate on the phone, then that should take place. So yes, it shouldn't be an issue.
Great, thank you. Coming over to you, Daniela, what would you say your top 3 tips are to becoming a disability confident employer?
I would say, just having the confidence to start that journey. It is hard and it can be quite daunting, I think, for organisations. Even exec level colleagues can be overwhelmed with it. So my biggest tip really is to reach out to other disability confident leaders and to those external experts that I mentioned earlier. And I would say we found DWP incredibly helpful. From a disability confident perspective, it is a government scheme, so they are the experts on what level 1 committed looks like through to how you move up to be a level 3 leader, and their support has been absolutely massive for us. And I would say the other thing is just to engage with colleagues. You need diversity and inclusion to be a really open conversation within your organisation, and it is important to people. And we often see people at offer stage question us a lot on what our D&I agenda is, and that will be the difference between them deciding to join us or not. And I think we'll see more and more of that, particularly as we move through into a post-COVID world, because I think COVID has pushed disability at work up the agenda, because a lot of employers who didn't realise how many colleagues they had with disabilities and health conditions because of the shielding measures brought in through COVID. I think a lot of organisations will now be realising that actually they had more colleagues than they thought that may need additional support to work to the best of their ability, and hopefully that's opened up conversations, which is really positive. But yeah, my tips would be to, have the confidence to start somewhere and to draw on external expertise.
Great, thank you. And I would echo that from a growth company point of view as well. I think, our top tips would be kind of be honest of where you are as an organisation, because I think you do have to start somewhere. And then, the way that disability is confident is set up, there is 3 levels, so you can kind of work as an organisation through those levels and take, improve as you go on that journey. And even as a disability confident leader, it isn't that you just sort of stand still and say, right, we've reached that disability confident leader level. You still need to be stretching to go further and do more. And also to echo Daniela, we've had some really great organisations that have worked with us, including DWP, to help us become disability confident leaders and give us feedback. And I think that is really vital, is to not just sort of look inwardly, but also look what other organisations are doing. There may be people who are further ahead in the journey that can offer you support and advice on how to get there. So there would be some tips that I would say from the Growth Company. Another question we've had is, are any of the charities lobbying government, as we know that disabled people always suffer most in a recession in terms of employment prospects? Just to quickly answer that from a Growth Company perspective, we are feeding back into our colleagues at the Combined Authority, and I know that they are themselves talking to government, particularly about how often in a recession those people who arguably face bigger barriers to moving into sustainable employment often get left behind in a recession, and so this, we are making sure that, we really want to make sure that that doesn't happen. I don't know whether Gary or Danielle or Mark have been doing anything around sort of getting that message across, whether it to be sort of locally or nationally at a government level.
Yes, if I can jump in there, please, Naomi. Manchester Deaf Centre actually sit on the Greater Manchester Disabled People's Panel. That's a panel obviously across Greater Manchester who have a direct line into the Mayor, Andy Burnham, and also other representatives on that panel sit on national panels and attend meetings with, directly with ministers from the government to kind of push this as an issue, particularly post-COVID, with the unemployment rates that we have at the moment. In fact, myself, I was with a gentleman yesterday who is big D deaf, sign language user. He's the only person in his workforce to have lost his job due to COVID, and he's the only person in his workforce who is deaf. So this is something that we are unfortunately, I imagine going to come across, and we really do need to be doing everything we can to support all disabled people back into employment and make sure that they aren't kind of pushed to the bottom of the pile, really.
Hi, thanks Danielle. I'd just like to pick up on a couple of the questions we've had that are around how do you encourage employees to come forward and share that they have a disability. So one thing I would say is that for colleagues to share that information, they have to feel like you are a psychologically safe business, and that comes from your culture. We all know, particularly those that work in HR, that cultural change can take a really long time, and it takes a lot of people a long time to make a difference. But one thing that we found really powerful was sharing colleague stories. So colleagues who were willing to be open about disabilities or health conditions, sharing those stories internally really encouraged other people to have the confidence to share that information as well. And I'd like to go back to the point I made earlier that as an organisation, you need to be open in that conversation with people. So during the recruitment process, not waiting for candidates to come to you and say they need an adjustment, but making it clear in all of your recruitment comms and in your adverts that you're really open to discussing workplace adjustments, and then giving examples of what those adjustments may be that you've done before. That can be really helpful in giving people the confidence, because by sharing that message externally and the disability confident logo, etc., you are making a really public statement that you are an inclusive business and you do care about disabled talent. So that would be my biggest tip for that, and also getting senior leaders to share their experiences as well. So one thing we found really successful was getting our exec board to share how they cope with stress and mental health issues they may have faced previously, because disability is obviously a massive spectrum. We don't just want to focus on one strand of it. But yeah, I think it's important that you open that conversation as the organisation instead of waiting for colleagues and candidates to come to you for that.
Thank you very much, Daniela. I'm afraid we have run out of time, so we haven't got a chance to answer everyone's questions, but we will come back to you and pass on details for those people who can answer the questions if we haven't had a chance to answer those. That draws us to a close today. I'd like to thank our great speakers and our partners Irwin Mitchell for hosting this event, and in particular James for all his hard work behind the scenes. Thank you all for joining us. If you would like more information or support to become a disability confident employer, then please get in touch. As I mentioned, all the details will be shared after today. So thank you very much for joining us. Take care.